Well, I'm a historian, and I believe that getting an historical perspective on issues that face us today helps us see them more clearly, and in some ways takes away some of the stress that's associated with trying to understand why things are the way they are. And so I think history gives us a really good perspective on issues of today. My book is about the conservation movement and the origins of the federal government becoming the watchdog for our environment. It began with this legislation that was passed in 1918, over 100 years ago. But this was the turning point in the way the federal government interacted with the states regarding environmental protection. This was the watershed moment that ushered in this era of the federal government being this watchdog that set regulations for the states and enforced them. Um, my book deals with the passage of this legislation called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which fundamentally changed the way in which people in the United States and around the world treated migratory birds. But it's proliferated into all types of animals and even to the environment itself, the overall environment. Before this legislation, each state was free to set its own hunting laws for birds and enforce them however they wanted. And as a result, there was excessive hunting and bird extinctions that occurred in the early 1900s. And many more birds were on the fast track to extinction. And so it was fundamentally a states' rights argument. The states wanted to preserve the right to set their own hunting laws and enforce them however they wanted. But this senator from Connecticut that my book is about, he saw a different way, and that was for the federal government to establish hunting laws for birds and enforce them. And as a result, this legislation passed. And now over 1,000 birds are protected. They cannot be hunted at all. These are the migratory birds that most of us know about. Over 1,000 species you cannot hunt, including the bald eagle and many others. And then there are hunting seasons that are established for all the states. So you can't hunt in the spring like they did prior to this legislation. So the importance of this legislation is that it ushered in this era of the federal government being a watchdog, a regulator of the environment. And before that, the states were free to set their own laws, and there was excessive hunting, and bird extinctions were common then, and many more were expected.
It's when we're talking about a situation regarding animals, it's always such an interesting. It can be a controversial topic for some. Um, Obviously, from my point of view, when it comes down to it, uh, I think humans first. I'm not a PETA person. I don't think that if you could save a person or an animal, you probably should save the animal. I guess depending on the situation, if it's your dog versus some other person, maybe I don't know. But I will say this that we as the kind of primary species, the top dog of the planet Earth, definitely have a responsibility to kind of protect our environment and the kind of callous nature that we think we can treat, other animals is definitely worrying, right? Because it can be a trickle down effect considering how you treating other life basically. And we know, nature, the ecosystem is kind of a, give and take, a push pull, it's a cycle for a reason that plays into each other and that makes Earth as stable as it's supposed to be, right? We know this, of course. So protecting the birds and the way, based on what you're talking about, seems valuable. Obviously, imagine if we didn't have the bald eagle, our nation's animal, basically. Eagles are pretty cool animals from what I've seen. So, can you explain the process Senator McLean went through to kind of get to the federal government to kind of make them act in a way that probably was against their previous opinions, especially in a situation where you had to get Republicans and Democrats to kind of agree that this is the best course of action.
Yeah, it was a 7-year struggle to pass this legislation. McLean was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1911, and his maiden speech in the Senate was on the topic of the importance of federal protection for birds. And the initial legislation was opposed by hunting groups and also the hat industry, the women's hat industry that wore these feathers, very elaborate feathers on their hats. Think of the Titanic and the kind of fashions of the passengers on the Titanic. But then it was the states' rights advocates that were the most strongly opposed to this legislation. They wanted to keep hunting laws in the hands of the states. There were millionaire hunting clubs all along many migration routes, and spring hunting was very popular. And business people would come to these hunting clubs and hunt in the spring when birds were migrating and nesting, and it was easy hunting for them. In addition, business interests wanted to have this plumage trade so they could hunt very colorful birds like the flamingo, the egret, and they would kill these birds and sell the feathers to the hat industry. So there were a number of very powerful influence groups that were against this legislation, and McLean had to create um, a group of a consensus amongst many other environmental groups and gun manufacturers. He enlisted, ironically enough, um, conservation groups like the Audubon societies. He brought these all together to create this legislation that took virtually 7 years to pass. So those were the key groups aligned against this federal role: hunting groups, the hat industry, and states' rights advocates. And he used a variety of tactics over a 7 year period to create consensus on getting this legislation passed in 1918.
It's very interesting, considering, and I was curious on the states' right aspect, before you even brought it up, on how he was going to convince states to kind of let the federal government take charge. That's definitely the a big conversation nowadays, in referencing a lot of issues that we've talked about plenty on this podcast, whether it's gun rights, whether it's abortion rights, whether it's certain educational principles, of course, and the value of states' rights versus when should the federal government get involved is always a tricky area to balance. When do you think that Senator McLean was found out or decided that this is the chance, or this is the perfect time for the federal government to get involved over the states' rights to do whatever?
Yeah, it was the biggest challenge to pass this legislation. He knew, and many others knew, that the U.S. Supreme Court would very likely strike down this legislation. So they actually did a workaround, if you will, Riddell. They came up with a solution that avoided the Supreme Court's ability to even challenge this legislation. And this is what they did. It's called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So they put this issue in the form of a treaty, and they had it signed between the U.S. and Great Britain, Canada, and several other nations. And it was the treaty power that allowed for this legislation to withstand a U.S. Supreme Court challenge, because there's something in the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause, and that what that means is that if a treaty is entered into by the United States and ratified by the Senate, it cannot be challenged by the U.S. Supreme Court. So, in effect, it was like a workaround at this early stage of our history, 1918, to create this um, legislation enabling the federal government to oversee this very important part of our environment. Now, subsequently, it was challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1920. It was a decision called Holland versus Missouri in 1920, And the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that the supremacy clause of the Constitution um, was powerful, was enough to allow this legislation to continue. And so the federal government did have the role at that time to enforce this new way of looking at bird protection throughout the United States.
It's very interesting. I could definitely see how a treaty would be possible because it's birds. So obviously the birds, the entire world has an invested innate interest or innate, want potentially to protect birds. They're not exclusively a United States situation, regardless, if they are naturally, born here or not. So I could definitely see how that's possible. So did he reach out to specific politicians, or was he granted a certain ability to speak to the other governments directly? How did that work?
Well, the key thing he did, Riddell, was enlisting the president at that time, who was from the opposite political party. So this really gets at the thrust of your podcast. Now, McLean was a member of the Republican Party, which, by the way, was the reform party of this era. This was the Theodore Roosevelt reformers, the progressive party. The Democratic Party at that time in U.S. history was pretty regional and very much dominated by the states of the old Confederacy. But what McLean did is he reached out to then President Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat, and the two of them worked together to persuade people from both parties to buy into this idea of the treaty. And they were successful. And this is an example of how bipartisanship is often the key to effective governing in our country. And it's a great example. I know when I talk to people about my book around the country, this particular theme really resonates, that a Democratic president and a Republican senator were willing to come together to solve a critical problem. And they persuaded members of their own party to get on board and pass this legislation because many birds were on the verge of extinction. The snowy egret, the flamingo, the wood duck, many other birds were on the verge of extinction. And Wilson and McLean came together and said, we really have to end this excessive hunting, and we have to empower the federal government to intervene and enforce laws across the country if we want to save these bird species. And they did.
That's definitely, I definitely resonate with that theme as well. The ability to do as such by Senator McLean. Um, with that said, in that situation, you mentioned that they were on the verge of an extinction,
Mm-hmm.
which tends to happen when it comes to humanity. Is they tend to act when only crisis is around the corner. Do you think there is any issues today that your book can relate to that we can potentially take an action to potentially come together and kind of rectify it or solve it based off the circumstance? In my all the kind of more social issues when it comes to abortion, it's hard for me to say that there's a crisis. When it comes to mass shootings, I mean, obviously there's been an up and down since COVID, but we obviously know that America has a mass shooting problem in comparison to the rest of the world. But can you argue that a crisis? Some would say yes, some would say no. There's a lot of differing opinions. But I guess the ones that you could argue is a potential crisis because of the potential ramifications down the line is the situation regarding Ukraine and Russia and Israel and Palestine. Do you think there is something that we can learn from that book that can help with these potential crises that is around the corner?
Yeah, I think the overall success that I saw in this legislation was centered around people willing to compromise and people willing to um, come together and find solutions to problems. And I see that that's lacking in where we're at today on some key domestic issues. You mentioned a couple, gun control, climate change, the border situation. I think those are examples of issues that many people really care about and think that we could find some solutions to those problems if each side would be willing to give up something and give something another and give in other ways to find concrete solutions. But we're far from that, and I think some of it is the leadership that we have, and I'm hopeful, like I said earlier in our call here, is that the finger pointing and the culture wars are going to someday end when we have a younger group of leaders that move ahead and look at the era that we're in right now and just say this just wasn't working. Something had to change, and we're going to be part of that change movement. But I just think the current leadership we have is just too locked in the past to come up with creative solutions to some of these big issues that we all care about so much.
I definitely see what you're saying there, and it's very unfortunate on the current state of things where it's more than a difference in certain opinions, whether it's like anti versus pro X, Y, and Z. There's a certain kind of rhetoric since Donald Trump where there's a kind of an anti-establishment, the government is against you populist rhetoric that is going on a lot in more so the Republican side, and also in the far left progressive side too. So having it in two fronts just makes things much worse. But definitely more popularized in the right. And obviously, like I said, it's related to Donald Trump. And with the new candidate Vivek coming on the way, kind of saying very similar things, this resonates with the people a lot. They hear and they want to kind of believe that yes, it's the government trying to go against our guy. So it makes it harder to come to a compromise, to kind of find common ground, to give that give and take when you have one side of the aisle thinking that the establishment themselves, the institution itself, is corrupt. So anything that they propose is bad. It's such an easy way to demonize the other side and not listen to them and think that you're in the right based off this kind of forefront ideology from the right. Um, do you think that this is something that we can potentially get past, to kind of return to a place of, commonality and
Mm-hmm.
trying to kind of work together? I may disagree, but we need to work together to get stuff done for the country.
Yeah, as an historian, I just kind of fall back on what can we learn from history, and that is, we experienced this American Civil War from 1861 to 1865, very bloody war. Country was split. It literally was. There were two separate countries at that time. We did emerge from that. It didn't happen overnight, though. I think it took several generations to move beyond that, um, to get to a point where new leaders emerged, younger leaders emerged, dedicated to solving problems and not rehashing and reliving the issues that precipitated the Civil War then. And so I take comfort in that. It might be a cop out, but I just believe that we are currently in something of a civil war. Certainly not as bad as 1861 to 1865, but there's definite polarization. I think we will emerge from this. When you're stuck in this situation now, you feel like it's never going to end. But when I talk to my kids who are in their 20s, they basically tell me they can't even relate to these current crop of leaders that we have, at least at the presidential level, and that they're looking ahead to a time when they will pass from the scene, and there'll be new leaders that will come forward that won't be stuck in the past, and they'll be focused on solutions, on on creative solutions to problems, because that's the way my kids are. They don't really care about Republican, Democrat. Now maybe this is just my kids, but they're not rooted in those past loyalties. They're thinking more about, how do we solve the key problems that confront us as a nation. And I think there will be leaders someday that will have that mindset, and we'll look back on this period of time not unlike the way we look back at the Civil War. How could people um, have gotten involved in that conflict for 5 years almost? And that's my hope. But I know it's not a quick fix. We all would like to solve these problems tomorrow, but that's the only thing I can really come up with, Riddell, in terms of um, how I see a silver lining in this cloud that we're living in.
Yeah, I definitely think that our generation, my generation, future generations should be able to learn from the mistakes that is going on now. I've said continuously on this podcast that we have the experience, especially my generation, living kind of before the social media area. Obviously, I grew up when MySpace was created, Facebook was created, now X/Twitter is created. So I kind of grew up before, during, and current, obviously. And the generation I live in and the generation after me, we should know how these things work in terms of social media. So when we pass it on based off our kind of uh conception, or pass it on based off our understanding on the damage that this can provide in terms of discourse, that can play dividends. And it's very similar to politics as well. Once we learn, or once we understand how certain things are going in terms of the willingness to kind of buy in emotionally to these ideological values to the point where it's detrimental to the country and to the world as a whole, America being the number one power in the world, of course. So I'm definitely with you there, but it obviously takes an effort from people on my generation, people in the next generation, that are understanding of these things to continuously push a message. That's why I feel like my podcast is a proper source for people to kind of get that proper context and proper understanding, and then pass on that message to everybody else on this is probably how we should be handling things, of course. With that said, kind of touch on upon the kind of environmental aspect a little bit more in depthly. Do you think there are other, or do you think there are environmental issues in America other than climate change, of course, which is a hot button issue consistently, that America is not focusing enough on, and their efforts are putting onto to change, of course?
Yeah. Well, the issue of protection of birds has changed since this original legislation was passed in 1918. We're no longer threatened by bird populations are not threatened by hunters, individuals who are hunting birds for either food or for fashion industry. That's pretty much a thing of the past. But we have new threats, and some of this is in terms of habitat loss. And so the Migratory Bird Protection Act is now being enforced against developers who want to create like a condominium in an area where there's unique bird nesting sites. And so this legislation has been enforced against developers. The largest fine ever levied by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was against a corporation, Exxon, when it had this major oil spill in Alaska. And so now it's changed to enforce mainly against corporations, timber companies, oil companies, developers who are threatening habitats, critical habitats. And this was weakened under the Trump administration. They wanted to change this legislation so that it could only be enforced when birds were intentionally taken or killed. But the problem is that most bird killings are through unintentional, like the Exxon oil spill was unintentional, but it still was enforced. Now, fortunately, the Biden administration has reversed that Trump ruling that it was only intentional killing that could be enforced, and now it's back to the way it was intended, unintentional and intentional. But this is an example of how important groups like the Audubon Society are to correct this misinterpretation by the Trump administration and to press for the changes in the courts to get it back on its solid footing that it is. And of course, the change in administration helped as well. The Biden administration came in and restored the unintentional and intentional um, take rulings in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So we have to stay vigilant. And it's groups like the Audubon Society that we need to continue to support because they're on the front lines of this struggle. And I think those groups are really important. Riddell, it's not the government, but it's the watchdogs of the government, groups like the Audubon Society. Really important to support those groups.
S Based on what you said and referencing kind of earlier precedent, obviously you referenced state rights, which is always a part of the conversation when it comes to implementing policy. But from what it sounds like, it never was a valid reason in terms of food or, fashion to kind of go after these birds that are going extinct. Nowadays, the conversation in terms of the United States is that one, we should, become a primary energy exporter, a primary energy country, which obviously also create more jobs here. So that probably would involve digging up oil, and being able to utilize the energy we have here to become this type of power, so we're not reliant on other countries, of course. And another thing that's popping a lot in terms of conversation is the housing market crisis, where we are not able to kind of find people homes. The housing market prices are rising. We need to build more homes for people. So, in referencing what you were referring to, some of the things you were referring to in terms of the oil unintentional issue and building potentially condominiums or other locales in these places where birds are migrating, this seems like a more complex issue because there's an want, at the very least from the right more so than anything else, there's a want to utilize these areas that will benefit the people because of need versus want. This time is probably how they would phrase it. It's probably how a lot of Republicans will phrase it. How will you battle something like this versus, how it was back in the day? It definitely seems a lot more challenging.
Yeah, well, let me give you an example of where it worked. The bald eagle, we've talked a little bit about, but in 1963, there were only 400 bald eagle nests left in the United States in 1963. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is the framework in which the federal government could begin to bring that bird back into uh, a reasonable population. And so now in 2020, the last count that I have is there's 71,000 bald eagle nests in the United. This is just in the 48 United States. It doesn't include Alaska, and there's more there. So we went from almost seeing the bald eagle, our nation's symbol, go extinct in 1963 when there were only 400 nests to now there's 71,000 bald eagle nests in the 48 states. So this is an example where government works. We're really down on our government for what it seems dysfunctional and doesn't seem to work. But this has happened in the last 50 or 60 years to bring back this beautiful symbol of our nation. And to me, gives me some hope. That first of all, you had the legislation passed, and secondly, you have the regulatory groups like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service administering the law. You have groups like the Audubon Society and others that are keeping everybody appraised of what's really happening and doing these counts of nests, and for instance. And this is a success story. I think it's easy to get down on how government fails, but I don't know about where you live in Ohio. I'm in Michigan. I see bald eagles. I wouldn't say commonly, but I'm seeing them. And this, to me, is a hopeful thing, that government can function properly. And imagine if we could take this same approach to other issues that we want to see solved. Having laws passed, having the right people involved in enforcing them. Um, I think this, to me, is a hopeful message that we can get past where we're at, based on what I've seen here with this Migratory Bird Treaty Act.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I guess my last question for you
Mm-hmm.
is there any other lessons that you believe that the people should know from the book that you wrote that will kind of, help them understand something, or, just another issue that they think they can, gain proper perspective from?
Yeah, I think the other takeaway I'd like to leave with you tonight is that leading change is never easy. Um, it takes special types of people to effectively lead change. And looking at this issue of bird protection, there were a number of lessons that I pulled out in terms of, um, how you lead change. And one is, um, being able to communicate the need for change, showing a vision that, um, there's a problem and it needs to be solved. And that's what Mclean did in the Senate. He talked about bird extinctions and how important it was to solve them. Secondly, you need to be able to overcome obstacles and be flexible and adaptable when opposition comes up. And Mclean did that by modifying this, legislation into a treaty, like we talked about earlier. But third, really important, is to learn how to build coalitions. And Mclean, change starts small, but it ultimately needs, critical mass. And when Mclean brought in Woodrow Wilson, a president from the opposite party, finding, unlikely allies to build a coalition to move change forward, is another critically important thing that I learned from this. So that's what I would just, leave your listeners with, Riddell, is that, we can't expect change, to come about easily. It's a struggle, and yet you need certain skills, showing urgency, being flexible and adaptable, and finding solutions, building coalitions. These are things that, I saw in this Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and I think we can bring um, those skill sets into, the issues of today, and try to learn how change was achieved in the past, apply that to the issues that we are facing today, and have some hope that here was a problem that people didn't think would be solved, and it was solved. And, we just need good leadership and people to see these things through, to move forward.
I definitely couldn't agree more. There's definitely a process when there's anything that you want to get past, or any change that you want to happen. It's not going to be immediate. The expectation for it to be immediate is delusional. Obviously, people that, maybe want, hey, I want this policy now, are just revolutionaries. And if we destroy the institutions and the system in place, all you're going to be left with is anarchy. So it doesn't bode well for what you have going on. So proper context is important, as well. More so than anything else, from what we saw, that if the issue is important enough to the public, to society, there's ways to kind of find an answer. And always keep in mind that compromise is a big important step towards that. Working with the other side, that is what politics is. The people who say, "Oh, just let's vote in all Republicans, let's vote in all Democrats, and just get all we want," that's not gonna work. That's not how it works. That's not how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be ideals challenging one another to come up with a solution. You're supposed to hit these roadblocks so you can iron out the pavement, the path, the road to a better solution. A bunch of yes men and echo chambers, you'll never find a good solution that way. So a lot of good lessons that you guys heard from today. Of course, you can obviously check out all his information on his profile on my website. Do you want to plug anything before I let you go here today?
Yeah, my book is available on Amazon, and it makes a great gift for someone you know that is interested in birding or conservation, has an interest in U.S. history. McLean knew 5 different presidents, so if you know people or yourself likes to learn about our presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, um, Woodrow Wilson, that era. It makes a great holiday, Christmas gift. So think about that. But it's available on Amazon. It's called The Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington, Senator George P. McLean, Birdman of the Senate. So thanks very much, Riddell, for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation. And I hope that the key themes that you find in my book resonate with your leaders, with your listeners, and that they can apply some of these to the issues that they care about today.
Yeah, I appreciate having you here, Will, of course. Definitely check out all that. The information will be in the description. Of course, you can visit the website to support the podcast, www.purplepoliticalbreakdown.com. You can support us on Patreon, of course, to join the Discord, of course. Rate it 5 stars, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Hope you guys did enjoy. Y'all have a good one. Take care. And